Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? Today, we're heading back to 19th century Europe,
Ah, the 19th century.
a time of revolutions, big ideas, and, you guessed it, the rise of nationalism.
It's fascinating how this idea of the nation state, something we take for granted today,
Totally.
really took shape during this period.
And we're going to explore it through a really cool mix of sources. I mean, we've got
Yeah.
historical accounts, political cartoons.
Even some symbolic artwork, which is always fun to unpack.
Right. It's amazing how each piece gives us a slightly different angle on this whole phenomenon.
It really is.
So, speaking of different angles, let's start with this striking print.
Okay.
We see a whole parade of nations, each with their own flag, all marching towards a Statue of Liberty.
It's a powerful image, isn't it?
It is. It just screams unity and hope.
And it perfectly captures, I think, the early idealism of nationalism, which really laid the groundwork for these ideas.
So, can you unpack that a little?
Yeah.
How did the French Revolution actually set the stage for this kind of thinking about the nation?
Well, the French Revolution really put the focus on la patrie, the fatherland,
Okay.
and le citoyen, the citizen. These became like rallying cries, fostering this sense of shared identity.
So it's not just about being loyal to a king or a ruler anymore.
Exactly. It's about belonging to something bigger.
To a nation.
To a nation.
Right.
And it's interesting, isn't it, that Napoleon, not exactly a Democrat,
No, not at all.
actually played a role in spreading these revolutionary ideas across Europe.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of those historical ironies. His conquests were, of course, driven by ambition.
Of course.
But they also inadvertently spread these ideas of national unity and legal equality.
Right, because Napoleon was all about reforming legal systems, standardizing things.
Right, exactly. Like the Napoleonic Code.
Yeah.
That had a huge impact, even beyond France. It's standardized laws, eroded old feudal privileges. So, in a way, he was unintentionally creating the conditions for a sense of shared citizenship,
Precisely.
even in the lands that he conquered.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating when you think about it.
So we've got these revolutionary ideals spreading, taking root. But, it wasn't all about armed uprisings and, storming the Bastille.
All right.
Liberalism, with its emphasis on individual freedom and representative government, that seems to have played a huge role, too.
Oh, absolutely. And sometimes it played out in some, unexpected ways.
Really? Like what?
Well, take the German Zollverein, for instance.
The Zollverein.
This customs union, established in the 1830s, it was all about economic unity.
Okay.
Dismantling those internal trade barriers, creating a shared economic space.
So they're thinking, hey, if we're all doing business together, maybe we'll start to feel more like a single nation.
Exactly.
It's like economics paving the way for national sentiment.
And there were economists at the time, like Friedrich List, who argued that economic unity could actually come before and even stimulate a sense of national belonging.
So it's not just about shared language or culture.
It's about bread and butter issues, too.
Right.
The practical stuff.
But I'm guessing not everyone was thrilled about all these changes.
Oh, of course not. You had the conservative forces, especially after Napoleon's defeat, they were clinging to the old order.
Right.
They saw liberalism and nationalism as, threats.
And we see that reflected in this caricature.
Ah, yeah.
It's got this group of thinkers literally being muzzled.
Powerful image, right. It really captures that fear of dissent that gripped certain parts of Europe at the time.
Yeah, it's like they wanted to shut down any new ideas.
Well, figures like Metternich, the Austrian statesman.
Right.
He was a big believer in maintaining the power of monarchs in those old social hierarchies.
So any kind of change, any talk of individual freedom or national unity, that was dangerous.
Very dangerous in their view.
So you've got these competing forces, these tensions between those pushing for change and those clinging to tradition. But it wasn't just about politics and economics, was it? I mean, the sources you've given me, they suggest that culture played a huge role in all of this.
Oh, absolutely. Culture was key. Art, music, literature, they all became tools for expressing and fostering national sentiment.
So give me an example. How did this actually play out?
Well, think about the Grimm brothers.
The Grimm brothers, like the fairy tales.
Exactly. They're a collection of German folktales published in the early 19th century.
Right.
Well, it wasn't just about entertaining children.
There was a deeper purpose.
Oh, yeah. By gathering these stories, they were helping to create a sense of shared cultural heritage for Germans.
Like defining what it meant to be German.
Exactly. And also, a way to define themselves against other European powers, especially the French.
So even fairy tales could be a form of nationalism.
In a way, yes. And it wasn't just stories. In Poland, for example, you had composer Karol Krapinski. He took traditional folk dances, like the Polonaise and mazurka,
Oh, yeah.
and turned them into these powerful symbols of Polish national identity.
So you're tapping into those shared experiences, those deep emotions.
Exactly. Music, stories, they have a way of doing that. And that sense of shared heritage, it often resonated more deeply with ordinary people.
Than some abstract political theory.
Right. It was something they could feel, experience, celebrate.
So we have this potent mix brewing in Europe. Revolutionary ideas, liberal aspirations, cultural ferment. And then comes 1848.
Yes, 1848.
A year of revolutions that swept across the continent.
The springtime of peoples.
Exactly. And we have this firsthand account of the Silesian Weavers' uprising from that year.
Oh, right. Powerful stuff. It reminds us that economic hardship played a major role in these upheavals.
These weavers, they were protesting their terrible working conditions.
Demanding better wages.
But it wasn't just about economics.
No, it was intertwined with these demands for political change, constitutions, representative government, and even the creation of independent nation states.
So it's like all these threads coming together.
Exactly. The economic, the political, the national.
But the big question is, did these revolutions succeed?
Well, that's where things get a bit more complicated. There were moments of hope, initial victories.
Okay.
But ultimately, the 1848 revolutions didn't fully achieve their most ambitious goals.
Why was that? What went wrong?
Well, let's take the Frankfurt Parliament in Germany as an example.
Okay.
This assembly, made up of elected representatives from across the German states.
Right.
They were tasked with creating a unified German nation.
Sounds promising.
It did, but it was plagued by internal divisions. And of course, they faced strong opposition from those conservative forces we talked about earlier.
So the monarchs, the aristocracy, they weren't ready to give up their power.
Not a chance. And in the end, the Frankfurt Parliament failed to achieve its goal of unification.
It's a reminder that progress isn't always a straight line.
Absolutely. Sometimes there are setbacks, revolutions that fail to achieve their immediate aims.
But even in failure, these events had a profound impact, right?
Oh, without a doubt. They revealed just how deep that longing for national unity and self-determination was.
And those desires, they didn't just vanish?
No, they continued to shape the course of history in the decades that followed. And that's where Germany and Italy come into the picture. But that's a story for our next segment. It's amazing, when you compare Germany and Italy, their paths to unification.
Totally different.
Like night and day, almost.
Yeah, with Germany, it's all about Bismarck and his blood and iron policy, right? Very much power play.
Bismarck, he was a master of realpolitik. No idealism there, just pure power politics.
So he was minister-president of Prussia at the time.
Right, and he really believed that power, not, some lofty ideals, was the only way to unify those German states.
And he proved it, didn't he? I mean, he orchestrated a series of wars, like against Denmark, Austria.
And finally, France. Each conflict, it just brought him closer to his ultimate goal. A Prussian-led, unified Germany.
So it wasn't so much a grassroots movement for a unified Germany, more like a top-down,
very strategic,
almost Machiavellian kind of strategy.
Yeah, you could say that. But, he also understood the power of nationalism. I mean, he deliberately appealed to that shared German identity.
To rally support for his plans.
Exactly. And if you look at the imagery from that time, it really reflects this shift, toward a more assertive nationalism.
Right. Like that famous painting of Germania, the female figure representing the German nation. She's often depicted with a crown of oak leaves and a sword.
Very different from that peaceful march towards liberty we saw in that earlier print, right?
Night and day.
This Germania, she embodies strength, military might. It really reflects how nationalism was becoming more and more intertwined with militarism and power politics.
Okay, so Germany's unification, it's a story of strategic calculation, military force.
Mm-hmm.
But Italy, they seem to have taken a very different route.
Oh, totally. Italy's unification, it was much more complex, I'd say.
Messier.
Definitely messier. A mix of diplomacy, popular uprisings, even a bit of luck thrown in there.
Yeah, it makes me think of Garibaldi and his red shirts.
Ah, Garibaldi. Now, there was a romantic figure.
Right. Storming through southern Italy, capturing the imagination of the people.
He was a true revolutionary, embodied that ideal of the freedom fighter. And his campaigns in the South, they weren't just militarily significant.
They added this whole emotional dimension to the unification movement.
Exactly. It became about passion, about fighting for your ideals.
But it wasn't just Garibaldi and his daring exploits. I mean, you can't forget Cavour.
Cavour, oh, the mastermind.
Right. Prime Minister of Piedmont and Sardinia.
Yeah.
He was working more behind the scenes, wasn't he? More of a political chess player.
Oh, absolutely. Brilliant diplomat. And he knew that Italy couldn't achieve unification on its own.
They needed help.
They needed allies. And Cavour, he was able to secure French support.
Which was key, right, to pushing Austria out of northern Italy.
Crucial. So it was this clever combination of, diplomacy and military action.
So Italy's unification, it was a team effort.
You could say that.
Cavour's strategies, Garibaldi's charisma, and military victories all working together. And by 1861, Italy, for the most part, was unified.
Mostly, yeah. Except for Rome, of course. That was still under papal control.
Right, right. But it's interesting, because even with unification, a lot of ordinary Italians, especially in the South, they didn't immediately embrace this idea of a unified Italy.
No, it took time.
Like that anecdote you shared about the peasants who thought that Italia was Victor Emmanuel's wife. I mean, that just shows you that national consciousness, it's not something that just appears overnight.
It's a process, right? It takes time to filter down through society for people to really internalize this idea of belonging to a nation.
Exactly. And speaking of complex processes, let's talk about a case that kind of challenges our usual understanding of nation building. Great Britain.
Ah, yes, Great Britain, the classic nation state, right?
That's what we usually think. But the sources you've given me, they suggest it wasn't so straightforward.
Not at all. You have to remember, British national identity, it emerged through a long and often very difficult process of English dominance over other identities.
The Scottish, the Welsh, the Irish.
Exactly.
So the creation of one national identity sometimes comes at the expense of others.
That's the unfortunate truth. It's not always a happy, unified story. And there are some pretty stark examples of how this played out, especially in Scotland and Ireland.
Yeah, like the suppression of Gaelic language and Highland culture, the forced incorporation of Ireland into the United Kingdom after a failed rebellion. Those are some pretty tough realities.
It's a reminder that nation building, it can be a messy, sometimes even brutal process.
So while we might admire Great Britain's apparent national unity, it's important to remember those voices that were silenced, those cultures that were marginalized along the way. History is rarely simple.
Never is. And as we move into the late 19th century, we see nationalism taking on a more, aggressive and even dangerous form across Europe.
This is where things start to take a darker turn, isn't it?
It does. Nationalism becomes increasingly intertwined with imperialism, the sense of competition between nations, and it really sets the stage for the horrors of World War I.
And the Balkans become a real flashpoint, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. You have this mix of ethnicities, the declining Ottoman Empire. It becomes a breeding ground for all these competing national aspirations.
And of course, you've got the European powers meddling, trying to expand their own influence.
Always. It's like a big game of chess with incredibly high stakes.
And tragically, that competition for power and influence, fueled by this increasingly aggressive and exclusionary form of nationalism, it helped pave the path to global conflict.
A reminder that nationalism, while it can be a powerful force for good, it can also be incredibly destructive when taken to extremes.
So, wow, we've really gone deep, haven't we? From those early idealistic visions of nationalism to, the darker side, the rise of imperialism, and eventually global conflict.
It's quite a journey. And, it makes you think, doesn't it? What does it really mean to identify with a nation?
Right. We've seen how nations are imagined, created.
Sometimes imposed, even.
Yeah. So what is it that makes someone feel like they truly belong to a nation? Is it language, a shared culture, a sense of history?
Those are all part of it, for sure. But I think it can also be something deeper.
More intangible.
Exactly. A feeling of belonging. A shared sense of destiny, maybe, and that's where things get really tricky.
Because when does a healthy sense of national pride, that feeling of belonging, when does it cross the line? When does it become something more exclusionary, even dangerous?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? When national identity becomes too narrowly defined, when it's all about what separates us from them.
Right.
That's when it can lead to intolerance, to conflict.
It makes me think of that quote, patriotism is love of country. Nationalism is hatred of others.
Yeah, that's a good one. It might be oversimplifying things a bit.
Sure.
But it does get at a key difference. Because at its worst, nationalism becomes a tool for division,
Right.
a justification for aggression, even oppression. And that's a dangerous path to go down.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into 19th century Europe, it feels like we're left with a lot to think about. I mean, we've seen how nationalism shaped the map of Europe, how it led to both incredible
It's
achievements.
terrible tragedies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's not just a story about the past, is it? I mean, nationalism, it's still a powerful force in the world today.
Oh, absolutely. And understanding its complexities, recognizing its potential for both good and bad, that's crucial for navigating the world we live in today. I mean, think about it. The same forces that shaped 19th century Europe, that desire for belonging, the allure of power, the fear of the other, those are all still very much with us.
It's like history is never really over. It just keeps echoing through time.
I think that's a great way to put it.
So to our listeners, keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, keep learning from the past, because it's all connected, isn't it?
It is. And who knows what other aha moments are waiting to be discovered.
That's what we're here for. Join us next time for another fascinating deep dive. Until then, keep those curiosity fires burning.